My dear viewers and listeners, what you are about to witness is a convergence in time. The medieval meeting the modern, the mortal meeting the celestial, and the diabolical. Two men, Rod Serling and Thomas of Cantimpré, separated by centuries and yet bound by their mutual fascination with morality and, most importantly for our purposes, the supernatural and the macabre. The two works under discussion? On one hand, a television anthology program by one angry young man, broadcast at the height of Cold War tensions, the fever pitch of McCarthyism, and the determined progress of the civil rights movement. On the other, a curious volume of moral stories in whose pages mystics rose from the dead with visions of purgatory, revenants stalked their loved ones with timely warnings, and angels and demons roamed the earth, zealous in collecting human souls. For your consideration, I would like to posit the following, that in the pursuit of moral clarity and a just society, these divine agents, angelic and demonic alike, are not so different as one might think. A point to be further explored among the bizarre inhabitants of both Dominican preacher Thomas of Cantimpré's Exempla collection, the Bonum Universalis de Apibus, and of course, in Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone.
This presentation will focus on the appearances of angels and demons and their interactions with humans, guiding them towards the straight and narrow, and other times, off it. By the time The Twilight Zone, a science fiction and supernatural anthology series, began in 1959, Rod Serling, a veteran of the Second World War, already had 3 Emmys under his belt, and saw this new project as a chance to challenge the increasing censorship of the McCarthy era towards television writers, and to bring nuanced portrayals of complicated social justice issues such as racism, nuclear proliferation, and authoritarianism into the living rooms of everyday American families. Serling had already attempted this with a television play Noon on Doomsday in 1956, which was centered around the 1955 lynching of African-American teenager Emmett Till. As Serling himself would say of this play, the play in its original form followed very closely the Till case in Mississippi. It struck me at the time that the entire trial and its aftermath was simply, they're bastards, but there are bastards. So, I wrote the play in which my antagonist was not just a killer, but a regional idea. It was the story of a little town banding together to protect its own against outside condemnation. However, Serling was forced by producers to readapt the story so that its overtures were not as offensive to white Southern audiences, including changing the narrative from the murder of an African-American man to that of an elderly Jewish shopkeeper after Serling's initial resistance. It is worth noting that Serling never denied the comparisons between his play and the Till case, much to the anxiety of the sponsors of the U.S. Steel Hour on which it premiered. Serling would later fume that his story had been changed from a critique of systemic racism to just an individual, a good, decent American boy gone temporarily wrong. Out of frustration with instances of censorship such as these was born The Twilight Zone, a medium where Serling could explore the themes of morality and social justice and, ideally, subvert the pen of the censors through fantasy and occasionally the macabre. While Serling himself penned a large amount of the episodes aired, he also partnered with such authors as Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson, further adding to the show's notorious twist endings, ranging from the truly chilling to the poignant to the hilarious and strange. Meanwhile, Thomas of Cantimpré completed the Bonum Universalis de Apibus in 1263, a final crowning achievement after a lengthy and successful career as a hagiographer, natural scholar, and preacher. He was writing for slightly different purposes. Namely, Thomas had been commissioned by the Master General of the Dominican Friars, Humbert of Romans, between 1255 and 1256, along with the rest of the brothers of his order, to write some of the more memorable stories and experiences that they'd had throughout their careers, for the edification of laity and clergy alike. The happy world of bees was dedicated to Humbert, with Thomas asking for masses to be said for his soul after death in return for his work. While a lover of science and philosophy, Thomas was known for his fascination with the supernatural and reality-defying miraculous interventions. Christina Mirabilis, a name here which translates to literally Christina the Astonishing, a woman who rose from the dead with an impervious body to take on the pangs of purgatory, and the mystic and close personal friend of Thomas, Lutgar de Weyer, were the respective focuses of two of his first major hagiographical works. The Bonum Universalis is a mixture of fantastic tales, interspersed with teachings from philosophers such as Aristotle and Basil the Great. Clearly, Thomas did not think the supernatural at odds with the rational, and was fascinated as a scholar even beyond his own personal feelings on the matter. Using extended metaphors on the lives and habits of bees from an earlier encyclopedic work, the Liber de Natura Rerum, the header of each section of Thomas's Bonum Universale compares the lives of those in religious orders and in the laity to the divinely ordered, moral and good world of bees, using these moral tales to further illustrate the points of the author. The definition of what exactly constitutes an exemplum has been contested, but for the purposes of this essay, an exemplum is usually a short story held to be truthful in the deeper spiritual sense of the word, and usually part of a larger sermon to impart a salutary lesson. And so, without further ado, we began our journey into this realm between the limits of reality and dreams, with a visit from the angels. A very particular angel makes an appearance in the second ever episode of the Twilight Zone, One for the Angels, the Angel of Death. The premise of the story is as follows. The elderly and kindly pitchman and beloved grandfather figure to the poor children of his neighborhood, Lew Bookman, played by Ed Wynn, is pursued by the Angel of Death, played by Murray Hamilton, and is told he will meet his end at midnight. In a final bid to save his life, Bookman tricks the angel, saying he has unfinished business. I've never made a truly successful pitch. I mean a big pitch. I mean a pitch so big the sky will open up. A pitch for the angels. Oddly touched by this request, Death grants it, only to find himself unceremoniously ushered out of Bookman's apartment. Thinking that he's conned Death, Bookman gleefully turns aside, ignoring Death's warning about consequences, until he hears a car crash, the screams of his neighbors, and realizes that a little girl has been hit by a car. Death wryly states that he must take someone with him at midnight, and Bookman frantically begs him to change his mind. For an angelic being ultimately supposed to be on the side of good, this might seem monstrous, but let us pause on Bookman's narrative and go back a few centuries to the Bonum Universale to shed some light on these ineffable motivations. In one of the Exempla, in Book 2 of the Bonum Universale, a devout man suffers from a painful illness, and an angel appears to him, offering him a bargain. He can either spend another year on earth suffering this painful illness, thus foregoing the pains of purgatory after he dies, or else die then and there, and spend 3 days in purgatory instead. The man chooses the latter, and when the angel comes to check in on him in purgatory, the man, in torment, accuses the angel of perfidious cruelty, saying, "O seducer, not angel, who deceived me through punishment over the course of many years instead of 3 days." The angel responds, "There's no delay. In fact, you have been deceived by torture beyond reckoning, because you have not completed 1 day out of 3 in purgatory." This angelic quibbling over terms in the face of human sorrow and suffering seems heartless on the part of the angel, and outright cynical on the part of the author. Indeed, it could certainly be said in Rod Serling's case that he had a somewhat pessimistic view of human nature, with many of the Twilight Zone's episodes, such as People Are Alike All Over or The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, centering on a skepticism concerning humanity's capacity to grow and be supportive as individuals and communities. In fact, for both Serling and Thomas, the constant guest in their morality tales is fear, and either the explicit or implicit fear of violence or death is the central motivation of most of the characters. In his 2000 dissertation, the scholar Pierre-Olivier Dittmar notes that out of all of the exempla within Thomas of Cantimpré's Bonum Universale, tales of death comprise about 42% of the tales within the work, this estimate excluding relic stories, visions of purgatory, and ghosts whose deaths have either not been narrated or not shown within the narrative itself. Yet, are these angels based solely in the business of fear, of keeping humans in line? In Thomas's case, the new doctrinal emphasis on purgatory expanded the notion of forgiveness and the need for community, especially with a vigorous focusing on the confessing of sins. No longer was it either or with heaven and hell, there was now a chance for those intermediate sinners to redeem themselves and achieve grace. In fact, to return to the narrative of the man in purgatory, after explaining his predicament, the angel offers the man a choice, saying, "If you wish to correct your choice, the Lord allows you, in his mercy, to return to your body, which is not yet buried, there to suffer for 1 year this disease which you already know." The man readily agrees, returns to his body, and, after suffering the disease and telling others of his experience, eventually departs again, this time to a peaceful rest. In this case, the seeming cruelty and deceit of the angel is meant to reflect a greater truth. That to attempt to play dice concerning one's natural span with the all-knowing God is not recommended. Rather than the angel deceiving the man has deceived himself, believing in his desperation and mortal ignorance that he understands the pangs of purgatory, despite never having been there or even being able to comprehend the passage of time within that place of inestimable torment. In the angel giving him a chance to see the error of his ways, the man is able to repent and gain heavenly rest. Not only that, but the man is restored to and becomes a force for good in his community, serving as an example for those around him. This is a theme that endured well into Rod Serling's time, with many of the angels of the Twilight Zone, such as those in Cavender is Coming and Mr. Beavis, being directly influenced by Frank Capra's 1946 film, It's a Wonderful Life, where a man, George Bailey, driven to despair, attempts suicide, wishing he'd never been born. His guardian angel Clarence shows him the error of such a wish, and the desolation of a world without his impact. In doing so, he shows Bailey his place in the divine order, and ultimately brings Bailey back to his community with a renewed sense of purpose and appreciation. The sense of community is important because, in returning and affirming the person's role among their peers after the crisis, the person has a chance to do the right thing. In Lou Bookman's case, he's left with a decision to either embrace his ordained departure or to subvert it and allow one of his beloved children to die in his place at midnight. Bookman decides to make his final sale to a bemused angel of death an hour before the clock strikes midnight. Here, Bookman makes his pitch one literally for the angels, causing an increasingly frantic Death, who has purchased all his wares, to miss his appointment. Bookman offers the final sale as the clock strikes midnight. Me, Louis J. Bookman, the first model of his kind. He comes to you with an absolute guarantee, all parts interchangeable, a certificate of 4 years serviceability, eats little, sleeps little, rests only a fraction of the time, and there he is at your elbow, at your beck and call whenever needed. Death accepts, and as the little girl recovers, Death and Louis Bookman leave together. Bookman accepting his fate, to quote playwright Douglas Broad, in a philosophical sense, a notion of endgame that dates back to the advent of civilization, not as an interruption of life, but a continuation, an eternal state that offers relief from life's endless disappointments. It is never made clear whether the angel of death, who was sympathetic to Bookman, allows himself to be played, knowing that Bookman would never let the child die, or whether he's genuinely won over by the pitch. However, he makes it clear that Bookman's life of kindness and generosity is to be rewarded. When Bookman nervously asks if he's going up there, Death winks and smiles, saying, "Up there, Mr. Bookman. You made it." In the Twilight Zone and the Bonum Universalis de Apibus, death is the moment of truth. If angels reveal the best of man, then devils surely must reveal the worst at the end. In some cases, this is strictly true. In a nice place to visit, a lifelong petty criminal, Rocky Valentine, is shot by police and dies unrepentant. He awakens in the afterlife to a jolly elderly man named Pip standing over him, who proceeds to offer him everything he could want, from women to gambling to an endless life of luxury. Rocky agrees, luxuriating for a time, before growing bored with having his every whim satisfied. He demands that Pip send him to the other place, where he'd at least have a challenge, to which Pip, with ghoulish relish, responds, "Heaven? Whatever gave you the idea that you were in heaven, Mr. Valentine? This is the other place." In contrast to the angel, who uses human folly to help humans learn from their mistakes and to reaffirm or encourage their ultimate goodness, demons are far more interested in using that folly to further the divide between the soul and God. Thomas of Cantimpré has a matching tale in his Bonum Universalis. A group of men sitting in a tavern, feasting drunkenly, mock the admonishments of clerics to guard their souls, when a strange man joins them. One of the men claims he would willingly sell his soul for the price of a drink. The strange man smiles, saying, "I'm such a merchant," and the sale is made. After a night of carousing, the stranger suddenly stands up, saying, "It is time for each of us to return home. However, before we go our separate ways, give me your opinion. If someone buys a horse tied with a halter, isn't he entitled to the halter at the same time as the horse?" The men all agree, and the unfortunate man who sold his soul is stricken with terror before being lifted, body and soul, and dragged to hell. In these stories, it is tempting to view the demonic as a mere foil to the angelic, a fear to keep people in check, and to add a flair of the dramatic and the macabre to the moral story. While this is true, the fear of the devil can also serve another purpose: to reaffirm the divine, and by extension to legitimize righteous moral authority and existing social structures. Thomas even includes a story concerning a demonic revelation to corrupt bishops, with the demon saying, "We offer happy thanksgiving to all of you because those subordinate to you are brought to us through your neglect, until together the whole world may be handed over to us. It is with regret that I speak to you thus, but I am constrained by the order of the Almighty." It is interesting, firstly, that a demon who is ostensibly benefiting from that very neglect would warn them of this rather than encourage it, and secondly, that the demon is ultimately ordered by God to do so, not by Satan. This implies that ultimately God's authority, and by extension that of the Church, have the final say in human affairs. On a more optimistic note, it implies that the powers of evil are limited by the ultimate goodness of God. However, as Rod Serling warns us, the devil is hard to hold. The Twilight Zone episode, The Howling Man, takes place shortly after World War I, as a man named David Ellington comes to a remote monastery on a rainy night, seeking shelter. The monks are leery of his presence, and throughout the episode, a blood-curdling howl can be heard coming from a barred cell in the monastery. Sick with the cold and wet, Ellington is finally brought to the head of the monastery, Brother Jerome, who reluctantly allows him to stay for the night. However, Ellington is accosted by the man in the cell, who claims he's been kidnapped and beaten by Jerome for the mere act of kissing a woman, and begs Ellington to free him. When Ellington confronts Jerome about this and threatens to go to the police, Jerome tells him the full truth, that it is the devil in the cell, locked in with Jerome's staff of truth, captured after sowing the seeds of corruption that would lead to the First World War. Jerome answers Ellington's skepticism, saying, "The devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape. I had seen him before in all parts of the world, in all forms and guises. Wherever there was sin, wherever there was strife, wherever there was corruption and persecution, there he was also. Sometimes he was only a spectator, a face in the crowd, but always he was there. When Ellington asks why this has not ended suffering in the world, Jerome replies, "We cause most of our own grief. We need no help from him. It is the unnatural catastrophe, the great wars, the overwhelming pestilences, the wholesale sinning that we've stopped." Sadly, even after his promise to keep the Howling Man locked away, Ellington is still swayed to let him loose. And as he does, he watches as the emaciated, weary man from the cell undergoes a diabolical transformation into the devil himself. Jerome charges Ellington to take on the task of recapturing him with the staff of truth, which Ellington does, finally tracking down Satan after it is implied that diabolic inspirations caused the horrors of fascism, the Second World War, and the Korean War. The episode ends with him warning his housekeeper not to let the man out, no matter what she hears. The final frame shows her hand moving the staff of truth and the closet door opening to a pitch black. Here, perhaps, is where fear is cast in a positive light, because in reverence and an understanding of the greater consequences of one's actions, fear for one's own integrity, as well as concern for the well-being of others, fear can lead to a better society. Here, too, is where the Twilight Zone deviates from the medieval. If Thomas found his solace in the promise of heaven alone, it is implied heavily by Serling that it is up to humankind itself to counter evil in the world, even if, as the closing narration in The Howling Man implies, there is ultimately no way to hold the devil forever. However, Serling's optimism, often a rarity in his Twilight Zone work, peeks through here. The show does not portray the evils of the 20th century, such as bigotry, fascism, and mass destruction, as part of some inevitable natural order or as something humanity can never change, and in doing so suggests that these evils can and should be resisted. As Serling himself said while addressing students in a 1968 speech at Moore Park College, "I think the destiny of all men is not to sit in the rubble of their own making, but to reach out for an ultimate perfection which is to be had. At the moment it is a dream. But as of the moment we clasp hands with our neighbor, we build the first span to bridge the gap between the young and the old. At this hour, it's a wish. But we have it within our power to make it a reality. If you want to prove that God is not dead, first prove that man is alive."
Both Thomas of Cantimpré and Rod Serling were fascinated with the unknown and explored anxieties about death, the nature of evil and corruption, and tried and succeeded to find hope, goodness, and redemption through the bizarre and unexplained. A relevant lesson, not only in encounters with the angelic and diabolic, but also in the Twilight Zone.